if Christianity is a synthesis of many, many ideas, and if all this stuff about religion is really looking at the best in yourself, the best hope you could have for yourself and your people and your family, and that it's embodied in faith in Jesus, faith in the resurrection, faith in heaven, faith in the angels and the community of saints and all that stuff. If that's what the Christian tradition is, and if that's a way of sort of being hopeful at a metaphysical level instead of nihilistic, if that is the way we do it, and we do it particularly in Ireland, then the funerals that we do in Ireland are important because we deeply believe in this sense of, it's hard to say another world, but a different realm or a different level of realization of reality. That in some sense what we're seeing at the surface level is not everything, and that people have a soul, and this soul is gathered up into God. And there's different ways of saying it. You know, do you have an individual soul? Does the soul, is it something absorbed into the unity of the Godhead? What is it all about? It's only language anyway, but from Hindu to Christian to Buddhist to Jewish to Islam, every single religion is really trying to express a collective idea of hope. And that's where the word soul comes from. And when we do funerals in Ireland, we take that seriously. And we take the month of November seriously. We take the month of the dead seriously. And it's kind of a beautiful time as well. I love November because, you know, you've gone through the harvest, you've gone through the Fover, Man 4, Jera 4, and then you have Samhain. You have this period of mystical light as the light dies a little bit more every day, and it slants sideways through the window every day. It's very, very dramatic and very beautiful. And you start to remember the dead. You start to go to maybe the graveyard to say a prayer for, you know, your loved one, or maybe you're engaged with the moving ceremonies around Remembrance Day in November and Remembrance Sunday. There's different cultural ways we express this sense of remembrance, but we all do it. It happens, every single one of us, in November. This sort of, you can't avoid it when you look at the trees. They're losing their leaves. The world is falling apart, and what we experience is it will fall apart, it will fall completely down into the darkness of midwinter, and then a little light will shine, and it will be like the resurrection. It will be like a new year beginning again. So this remembrance of the dead is not a kind of a surface level, grim, gothic idea of decay, but it's a sense of letting go. I think that's the biggest thing you could say about funerals. They are rituals that allow us to let go of our loved ones. And sometimes even when somebody is passing away, you'll notice there's a moment where they let go. And it's as if, I believe this, it's as if their journey is still ongoing, but they're in an awakened state at a level that's deeper than where we are. What we see is somebody struggling in pain or suffering for their last breath, climbing that great mountain, that hill towards death. And yet sometimes we can feel that in that bed or in that chair, the person we love comes to a moment where they almost turn their back on us because they're beginning to go somewhere else. There's a sense that the room is opening up. I've often felt that in a room where somebody is very ill. There's a sense that the room is opening up. You know, that it's almost like the roof has been taken off. The ceiling has been taken off. It's almost as if the sky and the cosmos is directly shining down into the room. Again, I know that's a visual way of saying it. These are the only ways we can grasp or name human experience. And we do all that well in Ireland. And this podcast is about the Tuam Babies. 7, nearly 800 children. We don't know where they're buried. It's most likely that they're buried in the grounds of the Tuam Mother and Baby Home. And it needs to be dug up, excavated fully and properly. And if those little bones are there, they need to be recovered and reassembled and given dignified burials. Now that's what needs to happen at a practical level in Tuam. The first reason for it is because it's only justice. It is unjust to deprive people of their grief. It's unjust to deprive people of the bodies of their dead. And you might think, well, it's not significant because, maybe the people who are looking to uncover those bodies never actually knew those children in person. Well, that may be true in some cases, but there are some that's not true. There's some cases where the little child is remembered by a brother, a sibling, a sister. But as I said, the argument is sometimes made in a careless way that, well, it's a long time ago. But think about it. I think about it. If I had a sibling that I didn't know about, if I had a half brother or sister, and somebody said, by the way, you had a sister, she was born the year before you, 1951, let's say. And I'd say, my goodness, that's huge news. And then imagine they said, yeah, but don't worry about it. Like, she died about a year afterwards. Oh, well, where is she buried? Well, we don't know that. You've opened something up inside me. I wrote a book called Talking to Strangers, and in it there's a central story about a woman who was my father's grandmother. And she was Polish, and she came to Ireland and she married my great-grandfather, and she reared my father, even though she was his granny. I wrote a book trying to share how important it was for me to find some record of that woman. And I searched in Warsaw, in the Jewish Museum in Warsaw. I searched in records in Ireland, in search engines, and asked people and discussed it with people and wrote letters to people. And eventually I found her grave. Because my father had kept the receipts of her burial. Now, he kept one or two other things that belonged to her, like, for example, a little pendant with a Star of David and the Hebrew words Mazel Tov inside the little Star of David. He kept that. But with it he kept the receipts of the burial way back in 1930s. So that I came across that receipt maybe 70 or 80 years later. And he kept that receipt so that she wouldn't be forgotten. It was the grave where she was buried. And I went to Dublin and I met the sexton in the Church of Ireland cemetery. And sure enough, he had the record in his book, Harding, the same name, Martha. And we went and he was able to show me the grave. It was just a mound, among other mounds, a little basket of eggs. he was able to tell me how many people were buried in it, and that she had been buried there and interned in 1936 or some date like that, I'm not sure, I think 36. And I stood at that grave, and it was very moving. I felt like I would feel in a church, like I would feel, if I was trying to open my heart in prayer to God or to Christ or to Mary or to an angel or to a saint, maybe a saint that I'm devoted to, let's say. I felt the same experience. And in these podcasts, I always say, when I'd be talking in these podcasts about prayer, I talk about the Mentor Deity. I would say sometimes I do talk about, that it's very good to light a candle. It's a ritual, it's a little private ritual. So you have a little Mentor Deity, meaning a holy picture of Christ or an image of the Buddha or whatever image that suits the tradition of your religious background. But a Mentor Deity, and then you light a candle, it's kind of a physical gesture of offering yourself, opening yourself at the deepest level of your consciousness to this beautiful poetic possibility that you are loved in this way, beyond even this life, in the transcendent depth of reality, that there is a bigger consciousness holding you, loving you, caring for you. And that is what prayer is in any religion. But do you notice I always say, whenever I'm doing that, I always say, or an ancestor or a relation. I do often say, could be a photograph of your granny, could be a photograph of a parent, somebody that can always and also function as a Mentor Deity, as somebody who is transmitting to you love, or a sense of the communion of saints, a sense that beyond the depth of our awareness, there is a deeper level, a deeper depth of ultimate reality. And in that ultimate reality, there is a great unlimited love and consciousness that has embraced all your ancestors. So that sense of praying for the dead is intrinsically, intimately connected with our ultimate sense of transcendence. They are the mediators, which is what the saints are called, which is what Mary is called. Mary, the Mother of God, Theotokos, is the great ultimate mediator, the one who is a mediator as a human, and yet she has gone into the great realm of transcendent being. And so we can use her template, her icon, as a portal into a transcendence that we can't really name. We can't ultimately name it. It's a poetic attempt to name it. But Mary is that beautiful door, because even in the historical record, in the gospel record, Mary is always the one who's accepting and allowing God to work through her. It's a very, very strong sense all the time. She kind of goes to Christ all the time, goes to Jesus, who's her son. She's a mediator. And then in the transformation of Mary into, Queen of Heaven, an idea, by the way, which somebody like Carl Jung thought was a very, very, very good idea. As far as I know, a lot of modern psychology would say that the kind of incorporation of the feminine into God through, the assumption of Mary, the idea of Mary as Queen of Heaven, that it kind of gives a hugely important balance, feminine dimension to the idea of God. All these things are a work in progress, but certainly they function for us in the same way as psychotherapy does. They function for us and make us whole and balanced in this present moment, to make us kind of more aware of this present moment, because we feel this present moment is more real, it's being held up, it has depth to it, it has a deeper reality to it, which is God holding us. And God holding and embracing everything belonging to us, and that must mean the ancestors. It must mean the ancestors. Maybe it means all sentient being. Maybe it means the entire cosmos. Because that is what we imagine as the transformation. You know the way St. Paul talks about a new creation. Everything is new and groaning towards this newness. Everything is transformed. He doesn't say humans, merely humans are transformed. All creation is transformed by this kind of coming of God, or a manifestation of God in human terms. It's a really interesting thing, this, because there's a great book by a fellow called Moltmann, Jürgen Moltmann. He's a German theologian. He wrote a book in the 1970s called The Crucified God. And he was exploring a new idea. Up till then, we tended to think about the story of Jesus and Jesus being crucified as kind of buttressed up by the idea that God was underneath the whole thing. Right, so you have the story of the crucifixion. Jesus is crucified, tortured, terrible, horrific death, and underneath it is God. You know, God is behind it, working through it, and transforming it so that it ends up not as a tragedy, not as a kind of a meaningless, nihilistic death on a cross, but actually as the very manifestation of love, the ultimate manifestation of compassion and love and God's presence in the world. That's the way it's supposed to be. That's the way we talk about it. There's a line in St. John's. I think John's Gospel talks about Jesus being lifted up on the cross, and it's the same word he might use, lifted up, to be physically lifted up, but it has the kind of dimension of being exalted, being transformed, lifted up, raised up. He's lifted up on the cross. Makes kind of a fusion of both crucifixion, resurrection. But all the time we're thinking about that crucifixion as like happening in real time. This is what's real, and then God's underneath it. And Moltmann says, if we're saying that this is a manifestation of God, like this is the completeness of God, and that changes human nature, the other way of looking at it would be to say that God is what's on the surface and the crucifixion is underneath God. Just try and think about that for a minute. That, in other words, rather than think about how human nature and how Jesus is changed and becomes the Christ because God is underneath it, well, just imagine God as the immutable, God as the Almighty, and the crucifixion is inside God, happening to God. How is it changing God? So that our idea of God after the crucifixion is completely transformed and changed, because God has experienced vulnerability, pain, suffering, death, loneliness, despair, depression. So you can no longer use the template of God as we had it. You have to stop talking about Almighty, all-powerful God after the crucifixion. Because the crucifixion is what happened to God. The vulnerability is God's. And that's what we're saying. It's very, very close, funny enough, to a sort of, if you like, constructive atheism. A kind of a deeply optimistic sense of the human spirit. It's very close to breaking the mold of the immutable, all-powerful God completely. And that's exactly what Jesus said he was doing. Fulfilling the law and transforming all the templates into a new commandment: love one another. So this huge outpouring of love, this huge outpouring of compassion, even as a realization, an insight that this is what the nature of being human is about now. It's about love and forgiveness. It's nothing else. And that is the complete presence of God. So that was a major transformation. And that not only, I think, did it allow the optimism that kind of created Europe, but it allowed us, right up until very recently, to have a strong confidence in the sense of what happens beyond death. A real confidence that even in our grief, there's something holding us. There's a very, very, very beautiful Jewish idea, which I'm not too familiar with now. I wouldn't be able to talk about it in detail, but the notion of mourning, the Shiva in Jewish culture, is very much a ritual of creating a space where the mourners are in a space. And this space is like, it's almost like the no God space. It's the space of emptiness. It's the space of desolation. It's like creating a space of sorrow in which to exist without the loved one because you have been bereaved. You just create this space. And we do it instinctively. We do it in a room or in a house where maybe the loved one used to be. We turn the whole thing into a mausoleum for maybe a week or a month or a year. And if we're damaged and there's unresolved stuff emotionally about the loss of the loved one, that grief can go on too long, and somebody can turn their house into a mausoleum for more than is acceptable, and then they get stuck in that grief. It's a very hard thing to see, to witness, but it happens. In the normal course of events, we need a space. We need that space to be alone and broken-hearted. I have an example of it in A Bird in the Snow. Is a book I wrote, a novel about how an old woman copes with grief and copes with death. And it's called A Bird in the Snow. And she goes out to town, then she comes back home from town, and she turns the key in her door. And in she goes and closes the door and locks and puts the bolts on the door. And there she will be from 5 o'clock maybe in the evening till the next morning, till she goes out again. And that long solitude, that long retreat that sometimes an old person who has lost their loved one makes every evening. There's a lot of people live in that kind of solitude. A lot of people over 60, a lot of people who've been bereaved live in that solitude. That loneliness is the sense of a space of desolation where it's almost empty of God. And the emptiness, and this is the really interesting thing, the emptiness is the presence. That in some sense, the wailing and the mourning and the crying expresses the grief of loss, but it's also the ritual that says, I'm also being listened to. Somebody hears my cry. So much of the Psalms, the poems in the Old Testament, so much of them are about, Lord, hear my cry. I cry unto you, O God. Hear me. And it was a psalm that Jesus was using. A psalm is placed in the mouth of Jesus as his last words. my God, why have you forsaken me? Because underneath the narrative is our faith in an all-powerful God who now sustains us in love. Then also underneath God, now, forever afterwards, underneath God is human suffering. You can't talk about an immutable God, an all-powerful God, unless it is the power of love, it is the power of suffering, it is the power of compassion, it's the power of understanding the poor and the marginal and the broken-hearted and the widow. It's the essence of being Christian. And I think that we got a lot of that very well in Ireland. We took it on as at an early stage in the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries. We evolved into a very, very sophisticated artistic energy in those hundreds of years. And I think it sustained itself. And when I go to a funeral in rural Ireland and I see the kind of power of connectivity between people, I see people holding each other, instinctively knowing with their bodies how grief needs a collective hug. When I see all this power of love and understanding, I feel that the Christian message is so beautifully alive in our hearts. And then I think of the Tuam Babies, hundreds and hundreds of children who were born, real human beings, who died, some after a few months, some in stillbirth, some after a year, some after a few years. Some died of measles, whooping cough, all sorts of different things. And there's no bodies. The record is there of their death, which would be really necessary, because otherwise we'd be go looking for them. You know, if there was a record of their birth, which there is, and then there was no death, well, you'd say, well, sure, this fella must be walking around somewhere. But no, all the death certificates are there. Hundreds and hundreds of them. And this is for one single institution in Galway, a mother and baby home in Tuam. All these deaths. For a period of about 36 years. That's all. From about 1926 or 25 until about 1962. I don't know I haven't gone into this in great detail. I just know the general information that we all know from the radio and the television and the newspapers. Hundreds and hundreds of little babies. And nobody, they must have been buried somewhere, but nobody has a record of it, where they were buried. So then, somebody in the 1970s, you know the story, two young lads at the time, and they slipped and they were jumping off a wall, they were going in for apples into the orchard in the convent grounds, and they jumped down off the wall. The ground went like hollow beneath them. They could sense there was a hollow cavern beneath them, and so they scratched away at the grass, and then they found a kind of cement or a stone thing, and they thought, well, get a stick and we'll pull that off, and they pulled it off, and they found themselves looking down into a cavern with bodies, little skeletons of babies. And people were kind of annoyed nearly, when the story came up about 7 or 8 years ago, 2013, 2014, 2013, I'm not sure even which, but, it was like, we've been through so much about clerical scandals, and here we go again. Jesus, not another one, right? But this really wasn't a clerical scandal. This wasn't a scandal at all. This was just a kind of a forensic thing. It was like, this accident happened way back in the 70s, where obviously these bones were there, and there was some sort of a graveyard there, and they had put up a little, shrine in the corner because they recognised it was some kind of a burial spot. And then the whole thing blew up into the story of the Tuam Babies. And the one thing that they presumed would happen when they did the initial excavation and when they found that there was a significant amount of bones in that area, when they realised definitively that there are all these hundreds of children who lived, were born, they then died, and there's no record of where they're buried. It's not an inconsiderable thing if you or me had a sister or a brother, like my great-grandmother, and the way that her story affected me, and the way that I kind of searched and searched until I found a grave, and the emotions that I felt when I stood at that grave. And they were very powerful for me spiritually. They were very powerful for me as a prayerful pilgrimage to find her grave. And when I found it and could stand at it, it was a sense of prayerful peace that was in me and coming upon me. And she was my great-grandmother. She was dead in 1936. I was only born 20 years later. Imagine if I had a sister or a brother, or if you had a sister or a brother, and somebody said to you, your sister died when she was 9 months old. She got the whooping cough or with some disease and she died. Very sad. You would say, I'd really like to go say a prayer for her. And there's hundreds of people in this situation, and the only place they can go to say a prayer for their loved one is the corner of a playground in Tuam at the back of a housing estate, which they know is the location of a sewerage tank. And the real shocking thing for me is that all this was fully revealed by an inquiry. 4 or 5 years ago, the process began and the archaeologists went in to look at the site and all the rest of it. And the archaeologists made, a temporary examination, and then they put in sort of protections to the site that were temporary. Everybody presumed that a full excavation would happen within months. It hasn't happened. 4 years later, it hasn't happened. It must happen. There needs to be a full excavation of the area if there is sufficient circumstantial evidence that there are human remains. It matters to the loved ones, but it also, I think, matters to us as a nation. Because for centuries we did funerals well. We understood that in the passing from this life, we were expressing our deepest faith and hope in the possibilities of the future, the possibilities for the cosmos, that there was a transcendent being that had journeyed with us through all the darkness of Golgotha, the suffering of Jesus on the cross, that the Father of all being, the motherliness of the entire cosmos, had her arms around us, that in this moment when Christ was stretched on the cross, Christ, as Teresa of Avila says, Christ became the mother. Christ was reaching out motherliness to the entire cosmos, and all was transformed. The story of how a human being is transformed by God simply in love, that God is the love in the human being. And the story of the corollary of that, how Jesus, suffering death, is something that happened to God, and that God has changed. So everything is changed. Everything is a new creation after the resurrection story. This is the good news. And we preserve it and hold it and treasure it in many, many ways. The breaking of bread, the sharing of the cup, the sense of solidarity, the sense of being committed to love, and to love your neighbour, but also to love your enemy, and committed to that, and doing it, embodying that every day of your life. That's what it is to be Christian. And in all this, when it comes to death and somebody passes away, they go before us marked with the sign of faith. We hold to them like the communion of saints. We hold to them like the holy ones. We commemorate them in November. First, on the 1st of November, we commemorate the saints, the ones that have been officially told to us. These are really holy people. They lived very good lives. Their power and psychic energy within your heart will do you good. And then we remember all the souls of our mothers and brothers and sisters and our children. We remember all the souls gathered together because we're expressing not a personal thing about Uncle Johnny who's dead, but we're expressing a collective sense that our hope for the universe, for the cosmos, is good. It's not nihilistic. It's not that we're just driven by power and we're going to destroy the whole thing. It's a hope that there is something good coming out of us. We are good. We are not bad. There may be so much darkness around us, but we are the light. We are the bit of light, and we will work to be that. And that's what we're expressing in the graveyard. That's what we express when we say a decade of the rosary and close the lid on the coffin. We're expressing the sense that these are children, these are parents, belong to God. And we will treat their remains with great reverence because their souls belong to God. And the idea that anybody in Ireland could dispose of anybody in anything that remotely can be described as a sewerage tank is obscene. That one single institution could possibly have disposed of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bodies of babies in that manner is obscene. And particularly because they are children. They are the innocent. I remember seeing a dead baby when I was about 18 years of age, and I was working in Lisdarn Hospital in Cavan as a night porter, and the night porter really had to do an awful lot of stuff. And so, on one occasion, a man came very early in the morning, and he wanted to see his child because the morticians had been in the evening before. They had doctored up the little body of a baby. He was going to be taking it home later in the day with his wife, but he had come himself to make sure that everything looked proper, that the morticians had done their job. And I was the porter, and I was the one who had to bring him over to the mortuary. And we went in, and he looked. There was a little white coffin on the slab, and the lid was open. I took the lid fully away, left it on the second slab, and the two of us looked into this little coffin at a little baby. It looked like a little baby. It looked like a gorgeous little baby, except it was white. It was wearing a white shawl. There was white trim on the white wood of the coffin. And what I remarked on to myself, and I've remembered it until this day, was that the little eyes, they were closed, but they seemed to me, they were almond in their colour. They were translucent with an awfully beautiful almond colour, the eyes. And the little fingertips had the same kind of almond, just not a cold white, painted white, but an almond white. It was just a beautiful, and it just looked like it should look if you were imagining an angel. And to me it was the icon of an angel. What's an angel? An angel is a messenger of God. An angel is a messenger of God. I have an image of an angel hanging from, the roof of my car, my Toyota Corolla. Between the passenger seat and the driving seat, they're swinging an old-fashioned looking. It's a kind of an Orthodox angel, if you can imagine. Russian Orthodox angel, be an old-fashioned looking fella. I like the feeling of a messenger from God that is not human, but that is in some way just in the realm of life and being, that is so beyond our realm that we would be inclined to think it doesn't exist. And my sense of angel was transformed on that day when I was 18 and I saw this little baby and I thought, that's an angel. It was like a Buddha as well. A sleeping baby is always like a Buddha. And Buddhists would actually agree with that because, you see, they would say that you're working through life, you're working through karma, but think about the little baby who has not created any negative karma in this life because they haven't had the opportunity. They haven't had the opportunity to do all the kind of selfish things that you and me have done. They're just starting out. There's nothing so beautiful. And there's nothing so poignant as to see one who cannot start out because their life has been taken. Their heart will beat no more. The silence in their ear will be broken no more. Their lips will never speak or learn a language. They will never say the word mother again. And yet there's something in the beauty of that visage, that face, that makes you feel, no, there must be a sense of motherliness in the cosmos that embraces this little baby's soul. This little baby must fly to God, to its mother in the cosmos, to be embraced. It couldn't be otherwise. When you look at a child like that, it could not be otherwise but to believe in heaven. And the terrible brokenness of a child death shows us more than anything the great chasm between how suffering we are, how deep in agony we are when we're bereaved, and yet some pure and simple marking image, face, like a sleeping Buddha, that almost tells us, be not afraid. Children who die, babies who die are like that to me. My father's grave and my mother's grave, they're buried in Cavan, and funny enough again, the very next grave beside them in Kilgarry is the grave of a little baby who would have died way back in 1973 when my father died, the week before him. He was next in the queue. And whenever I stand at my father's grave and my mother's grave, I look over and I think, my father was next in the queue. That little baby went ahead of him. And every year that I go back to the grave Sunday, which I haven't been at for a couple of years with COVID and my own illness and a few other things, to my shame, I haven't been there for about 5 years. But every time I do go back to grave Sunday, or at any day, if I was passing through heading for Dublin and I might stop and go up to the grave and have a look and say a prayer, I will always look to the left and I'll always see a recent detail. That grave still attended. It's how many years later now? 50. Still attended. Still a little teddy bear sometimes, a fresh rose, or something at Christmas that would have related to a child. The way we mind our graves and the way we remember our dead is very, very special in Ireland. The way we remember the dead in November is special. And the way that the dead are not dead to us, but they have passed beyond the shadow of death, embraced and held by the great motherliness of God. Their souls are free. I can't conceive of anybody desecrating the bones of a young infant. I cannot conceive of it. But it happened not once or twice, but nearly 800 times. $770 times. And so all that's required now is please, please, powers that be, governments, people in charge, please, get on with the excavation, exhume these bodies, reverently and dignified, and ensure that they're buried with reverence and love, so that their loved ones can have closure. I'm doing this because it's November, and I'm going to make for me a little pilgrimage to Tuam on Sunday, which will be the 14th of November, 2021. And I'm going to go, and I'll be there when they have a little ritual. There's a lantern. We'll be travelling across Mayo and Galway on Sunday. A little lantern as a light to represent those children, and it will come to where they think, presume, know there are remains in that sewage area, little corner of a playground in Tuam. And there will be, I imagine, some of the people who have lost loved ones there. And they will hold a little moment's prayer and vigil, a moment of remembrance. And they will hope and pray that somebody soon will do what needs to be done if we are to continue to call ourselves civilized. It's really just been a very heartfelt meditation. I like to remember the dead in November, and this one was really special. Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.